This is StoryLink Radio. The professional storytellers at StoryLink Radio have been around for a long time. The Irish knew storytellers by the name Shawnee. We are committed to bringing stories to life through the spoken word, as in traditional oral storytelling. We present stories of many genres: ancient myths and legends, short stories, full-length novels, science fiction, high fantasy, philosophy, traditions, classics, drama, fiction, non-fiction, romance, theater, ghosts and haunts, stories of the strange, and much, much more. Our stories may be drawn from contemporary sources or from some dusty, near-forgotten tome. Regardless, it is a treat like no other to listen to stories and tales presented in a live format with the emotion and feeling a true professional storyteller brings, conjuring up images of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. So join us at StoryLink Radio and let us be your Shawnee for a time. Our stories are presented before a live audience, then recorded for the StoryLink Radio podcast for your on-demand listening pleasure. Please visit StoryLinkRadio.com for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Visit www.storylinkradio.com. Tonight's story is The Haunted and the Haunters by Edward Bulwer Lytton. This is a story from 1843, and it's widely touted as the archetype for all haunted house stories to follow. It's in fact from the author who gave us that famous opening line, "It was a dark and stormy night." A friend of mine, who's a man of letters and a philosopher, said to me one day, as if between jest and earnest, "Fancy, since we last met, I've discovered a haunted house in the midst of London." "Really? Haunted? By what? Ghosts?" "Well, I can't answer that question. All I know is this. 6 weeks ago, my wife and I were in search of a furnished apartment. Passing a quiet street, we saw in the window of one of the houses a bill, apartments furnished, it said. The situation suited us. We entered the house. We liked the rooms. We engaged them by the week. And we left them on the third day. No power on earth could have reconciled my wife to stay longer, and I don't wonder at it." "Why? What on earth did you see?" "Excuse me, I have no desire to be ridiculed as a superstitious dreamer. Nor, on the other hand, could I ask you to accept my affirmation, what you would hold to be incredible without the evidence of our own senses. Let me only say this. It was not so much what we saw or heard that drove us away, as it was an undefinable terror which seized both of us when we passed through the doors of a certain unfurnished room, in which we neither saw nor heard anything. And the strangest marvel of all was, mark me, that for once in my life, I agreed with my wife, and allowed after the third night that it was impossible to stay a fourth in that house. Accordingly, on the fourth morning, I summoned the woman who kept the house, who attended on us, and I told her that the rooms did not quite suit us, really, and we would not stay out our week. She said dryly, and I know why, too. But you've stayed longer than any other lodger. Few ever stayed a second night, none before you a third night, but I take it that they have been very kind to you." "They? Who is they?" I asked, affecting a smile. "Why, they who haunt that house, whoever they are. I don't mind them. I remember them many years ago when I lived in this house, not as a servant, but I know they will be the death of me someday. I don't care. I'm old. I must die soon anyhow, and then I shall be with them and in this house still." "Well, you excite my curiosity," said I. "Nothing I should like better than to sleep in a haunted house. I bet that most of us would like to sleep in a haunted house at least one night, wouldn't we? Pray, give me the address of the one which you left so ignominiously." Very well, that house is situated on the north side of Oxford Street, in a dull but respectable thoroughfare. I found the house shut up. No bill at the window, no response to my knock. As I was turning away, a beer boy collecting pewter pots at the neighbouring area said, "Do you want anyone at that house, sir?" "Yes, I heard it was to be let." "Let? Why, the woman who kept that house is dead. She's been dead these 3 weeks, and no one can be found to stay there, though Mr. James offered ever so much. He offered my mother, who charged for him,
£1 a week just to open and shut the windows, and she wouldn't do it.
She wouldn't? Why not, ever?
Well,
said the boy,
the house is haunted, sir. And the old woman who kept it was found dead in her bed, with her eyes wide open. They say the devil strangled her, and I think those who crave sleep might just be forewarned.
Who? You speak of Mr. James. Is he the owner of the house?
Yes, he is.
Yes, well, where does he live, boy?
In Granger Street. Number 23.
Well, what is he? Is he in any business?
No, sir, nothing particular. He's a single gentleman.
Well, I gave the pot boy the gratuity earned by his liberal information and proceeded to Mr. James in Granger Street, which was close by the street that boasted said haunted house. Now, it turns out I was lucky enough to find Mr. James at home, an elderly man with an intelligent countenance and prepossessing manners. I communicated my name and my business frankly. I said I heard the house was considered to be haunted, and that I had a strong desire to examine a house with so equivocal a reputation that I would be greatly obliged if he would allow me to hire it, though only for a night. I was willing to pay for that privilege whatever he might be inclined to ask. Sir, said Mr. James with great courtesy, the house is at your service for as short or as long a time as you please. Rent is out of the question. The obligation will be on my side should you be able to discover the cause of this strange phenomenon at which present deprives me of all its value. I cannot let it. I cannot even get a servant to stay in the damn house in order to keep it in order or answer the door. Unluckily, sir, the house is haunted, if I may use that expression, not only by night but by day, though at night the disturbances are more unpleasant and sometimes of a more alarming character. The poor old woman who died in it 3 weeks ago was a pauper whom I took out of a workhouse, for in her childhood she had been known to some of my family and had once been in such good circumstance that she had rented that house of my uncle. She was a woman of superior education and strong mind you. She was the only person I could ever induce to remain in the house. Indeed, since her death, which was sudden, and the coroner's inquest, which gave it notoriety in the neighbourhood, I have so despaired of finding any person to take charge of the house, much more tenant, that I would willingly let it rent free for a year to anyone who would pay its rates and taxes. So how long is it since the house has acquired this sinister character you speak of? How long? Oh, I hardly know that, but it's been many years. The old woman I spoke of, she said it was haunted when she rented it between 30-40 years ago. Me, I returned to England last year and inheriting the fortune of an uncle, among whose possessions was the house in question. I found it shut up and uninhabited. I was told that it was haunted, that no one would inhabit it. I spent some money in repairing it. I added to its old-fashioned furniture a few modern articles, and I advertised it. I obtained a lodger for a year. He was a colonel on half pay. He came in with his family, a son and a daughter, and 4 or 5 servants. And they all left the house the very next day, although each of them declared that he had seen something different from that which had scared the others. A something still was equally terrible to all. And then I put in the old woman I spoke of, and she was empowered to let the house and the apartments. I never had one lodger who stayed more than 3 days. I do not tell you their stories here. No 2 lodgers have ever had exactly the same phenomenon repeated. It is better that you should judge for yourself, sir, than enter the house with an imagination influenced by previous narratives. Only be prepared to see and to hear something or other, and take whatever precautions you yourself please. Well, have you never had a curiosity yourself to pass a night in the house? Oh, well, yes. I passed not a night, but 3 hours in broad daylight alone in that house. My curiosity is not satisfied, but it's, shall we say, quenched. I have no desire to renew the experiment. You cannot complain, you see, sir, that I have not sufficiently been candid. Unless your interest be exceedingly eager, and your nerves unusually strong, like Rick over there, I honestly add, I advise you not to pass a night in that house. Well, turns out my interest is exceedingly keen, and though only a coward will boast of his nerves in situations wholly unfamiliar to him, Yet my nerves have been seasoned in such a variety of danger that I have a right to rely on them, even in a so-called haunted house, eh? Mr. James said very little more to me. He took the keys out of the house of his bureau. He gave them to me, and thanking him cordially for his frankness as obeying concession to my wish, I carried off my prize. Then I reminded the folks around me that if they simply wanted to hear this story and their friends couldn't get in, they could send them over to the Shawnee Library simply for hearing the story, because we're live there also. At any rate, impatient for the experiment, as soon as I reached home, I summoned my confidential servant, a young man of gay spirits, fearless temper, and as free from superstitious prejudice as anyone I could think of. "Franklin," I said, "you remember in Germany how you and I, we are not finding a ghost in that old castle, which was said to be haunted by a headless apparition? We looked all night. We looked 3 nights, I think. We never did find that ghost, did we? Well, Franklin, my friend, I have heard of a house in London, which I have reason to hope is decidedly haunted. I mean to sleep there tonight. From what I hear, there's no doubt that something will allow itself to be seen, or to be heard. Something perhaps excessively horrible. Do you think if I take you with me, I may rely on your presence of mind, whatever may happen?" "Oh, sir, pray trust me," answered Franklin, grinning with delight. "Very well. Franklin, here are the keys of the house. This is the address. Go now. Select for me any bedroom you please, all right? And since the house has not been inhabited for weeks, make up a good fire, won't you, Franklin? Air the bed well. See, of course, that there are candles as well as fuel. Take with you my revolver and my dagger. So much for my weapons. Arm yourself equally well. If we are not a match for a dozen ghosts, we shall be but a sorry couple of Englishmen, eh?" Now, you and me, folks, I'm not sure knives and guns are any good against ghosts, but what do I know? I'm just a storyteller. So I was engaged for the rest of the day on business so urgent that I had not leisure to think much on the nocturnal adventure to which I had plighted my honor. I dined, alone, very late, and while dining, read, as is my habit. Accordingly, about 9:30, I put the book into my pocket and I strolled leisurely towards the haunted house. I took with me a favorite dog, an exceedingly sharp, bold, and vigilant bull terrier, a dog fond of prowling about strange and ghostly corners and passages at night in search of rats. Oh, yes, he was a dog of dogs for ghosts. It was a summer night, but chilly, the sky somewhat gloomy and overcast. Still there was a moon, faint and sickly, but still a moon, and if the clouds permitted, after midnight would be brighter. I reached the house, I knocked, and my servant opened with a cheerful smile. "All right, sir. It's all right and very comfortable in here." "Oh," I said, rather disappointed. "So you've not seen or heard anything remarkable?" "Well, sir, I must own that I've heard something a bit queer." What? Tell me. "Well, I don't know, sir. I think I heard the sound of pattering feet behind me, and once or twice small noises like whispers close at my ear, but nothing more than that." "You're not at all frightened?" "I? Oh, not a bit of it." And Franklin's bold look reassured me on one point, namely that, happen what might, Franklin would not desert me on this night. We were in the hall. The street door closed, and my attention was now drawn to my dog. He had at first run in eagerly enough, but once inside the house had sneaked back to the door and was scratching and whining to get out. After patting him on the head and encouraging him gently, the dog seemed to reconcile himself to the situation and followed me and Franklin through the house, keeping close at my heels instead of hurrying inquisitively in advance, which was his usual and normal habit in all strange places. We first visited the subterranean apartments, the kitchen and other offices, and especially the cellars, in which last there were 2 or 3 bottles of wine still left in a bin covered with cobwebs, and evidently by their appearance undisturbed for many years. 2 of them I couldn't read. The third was a quality Amontillado. In any event, it was clear that the ghosts were not wine bibbers. For the rest, we discovered nothing of interest. There was a gloomy little backyard with very high walls. The stones of this yard were very damp, and what with the damp and what with the dust and smoke and grime on the pavement, our feet left a slight impression wherever we passed. And now appeared the first strange phenomenon witnessed by myself in this strange abode. I saw just before me the print of a foot suddenly form itself on the ground, as it were. I stopped, I caught hold of my servant and pointed to it. In advance of that footprint, as suddenly, dropped another. We both saw it. I advanced quickly to the place. The footprint kept advancing before me. A small footprint. The footprint of a child. The impression was too faint thoroughly to distinguish the shape, but it seemed to us both that it was the print of a naked foot. This phenomenon ceased when we arrived at the opposite wall, nor did it repeat itself on returning. We remounted the stairs, and we entered the rooms on the ground floor, a dining parlor, a small back parlor, and still a smaller third room that had been probably appropriated to a footman, all still as death. We then visited the drawing rooms, which seemed fresh and new. In the front room, I seated myself in an armchair. Franklin placed on the table the candlestick with which he had lighted us. I told him to shut the door. As he turned to do so, a chair opposite to me moved from the wall quickly and noiselessly and dropped itself about a yard from my own chair immediately fronting me. I laughed, and my dog put back his head and howled. Franklin, coming back, had not observed the movement of the chair now before me. He employed himself in stilling the dog. I continued to gaze on that empty chair. Empty, I say, but I fancied I saw in it a pale, blue, misty outline of a human figure, but an outline so indistinct that I could only distrust my own vision. The dog now was quiet. Put back that chair opposite to me, said I to Franklin. Put it back to the wall. Franklin obeyed. Was that you, sir? He said, turning abruptly. I? What? Why, something struck me. I felt it sharply on the shoulder. Just here, sir. No, I said. Wasn't I. But Franklin, it appears we have jugglers present, and though we may not discover their tricks, we shall catch them before they frighten us. Well, Franklin and I did not stay long in the drawing rooms. In fact, they felt so damp and so chilly that I was glad to get to the fire upstairs. We locked the doors of the drawing rooms, a precaution which I should observe we had taken with all the rooms we had searched below. The bedroom Franklin had selected for me was the best on the floor, a large room with 2 windows fronting the street. The 4-posted bed, which took up no inconsiderable space, was opposite to the fire, which burned clear and bright. A door in the wall to the left, between the bed and the window, communicated with the room which my servant appropriated to himself. Now this last was a small room with a sofa bed, had no communication with the landing place. No other door but that which conducted to the bedroom I was to occupy. On either side of my fireplace was a cupboard without locks, flush with the wall and covered with the same dull brown paper. We examined these cupboards, only hooks to suspend female dresses, nothing else. We sounded the walls, evidently solid, and the outer walls of the building. Having finished a survey of these apartments quite thoroughly, warmed myself a few moments, and I lighted my cigar. I then, still accompanied by Franklin, went forth to complete my reconnoitre. In the landing place, there was another door that was closed firmly. Sir, said my servant in surprise, I unlocked this door with all the others when I first came. It cannot have got locked from the inside, for... Before he had finished his sentence, the door, which neither of us was touching, mind you, opened quietly of itself. We looked at each other in a single instant. The same thought seized us both. Some human agency might be detected here. I rushed in first, my servant followed. It was a small, blank, dreary room without furniture. A few empty boxes and hampers in the corner, a small window, the shutters closed, not even a fireplace. No other door but that by which we had entered. No carpet on the floor. And the floor seemed very old, uneven, worm-eaten even, bended here and there, as was shown by the wider patches on the wood. Yet there was no living being here, and no visible place in which a living being could possibly have hidden. So as we two stood gazing around, the door by which we had entered closed as quietly as it had before opened, and Franklin and I were imprisoned. For the first time, I felt a creep of undefinable horror. Not so my servant, though.
"Why, they don't think to trap us, sir. I could break that trumpery door with a kick of my foot."
"Well, I'm sure you could, Franklin, but try first if it'll open to your hand, won't you?" I said, shaking off the vague apprehension that had seized me, while I unclosed the shutters and see what is without. I unbarred the shutters and threw up the sash, and the windows looked on a little backyard I have before described. There was no ledge without, nothing to break the sheer descent of the wall. No man getting out of that window would have found any footing till he had fallen on the stones far below. Franklin, meanwhile, was vainly attempting to open said door. He now turned round to me and asked my permission to use force. Now, I should here state that, in justice to my servant, that, far from evincing any superstitious terrors, his nerve, his composure, and even gaiety amid circumstances so extraordinary, compelled my admiration. He seemed to be having a great fun at this place, and it made me congratulate myself in having secured a companion in every way fitted to the occasion. So I willingly gave Franklin the permission he required. But though Franklin was a remarkably strong man, his force was as idle as his milder efforts. The door did not even shake to his stoutest kick. Breathless and panting, at last he desisted. I then tried the door myself, equally in vain. As I ceased from the effort, again that creep of horror came over me. But this time it was more cold and stubborn. I felt as if some strange and ghastly exhalation were rising up from the chinks of that rugged floor and filling the atmosphere with a venomous influence hostile to human life. The door, now, very slowly and quietly, opened again of its own accord. Franklin and I precipitated ourselves out onto the landing place. We both saw a large, pale light, as large as a human figure, but shapeless, unsubstantial, like a cloud you might see when an avatar reses in, but doesn't quite res, if you know what I mean. We saw this large, pale light move before us and ascend the stairs that led from the landing into the attics. I followed the light, and my servant followed me. It entered, to the right of the landing, a small garret of which the door stood open. I entered in the same instant. The light then collapsed into a small globule, exceedingly brilliant and vivid, rested a moment on the bed in the corner, quivered, and vanished. We approached the bed and we examined it. A half-tester, such as commonly found in the attics devoted to servants. On the drawers that stood near it, we perceived an old, faded silk kerchief, with the needle still left and a rent half-repaired. The kerchief was covered with dust. Probably it had belonged to the old woman who had last died in that house, and this might have been her sleeping room. I had sufficient curiosity, some may say nosiness, to open the drawers. There were a few odds and ends of female dress, and there were 2 letters, tied round with a narrow ribbon of faded yellow. I took the liberty to possess myself of these letters. We found nothing else in the room worth noticing, nor did the light reappear, but we distinctly heard, as we turned to go, a pattering footfall on the floor just before us. We went through the other attics, the footfall still preceding us. Nothing to be seen, nothing but the footfall heard. I had the letters in my hand. Just as I was descending the stairs, I distinctly felt my wrist seized, and a faint, soft effort made to draw the letters from my clasp. I only held them all the more tightly, and the effort ceased. We regained the bedchamber appropriated to myself, and I then remarked that my dog had not followed us when we had left. In fact, my poor dog was thrusting himself close to the fire and trembling. I was impatient to examine those letters, and while I read them, My servant opened a little box which he had deposited the weapons I had ordered him to bring. He took them out and he placed them on a table close to the head of my bed, and then he occupied himself in soothing my dog, who, however, seemed to heed him very little. The letters were short. They were dated, and the date's exactly 35 years ago. They were evidently from a lover to his mistress. Ah, Talia, maybe you were right. Or a husband to some young wife. Not only the terms of expression, but a distinct reference to a former voyage indicated the writer to have been a seafarer. Topper was fun. The spelling and the handwriting were those of a man imperfectly educated, but still the language itself was forcible. In the expressions of endearment there was a kind of rough and wild love. But here and there were dark, unintelligible hints at some secret, not of love, some secret that seemed of crime. "We ought to love each other," was one of the sentences I remembered, "for how everyone else would execrate us if all was known, my dear." And then again, "Don't let anyone be in the same room with you at night. You talk in your sleep." And again, "What's done cannot be undone, and I tell you there's nothing against us unless the dead come to life." And here, I examined the letter closely. There was underlined in a better handwriting, a female's handwriting, "They do." At the end of the letter, the latest in date, the same female hand had written these words, "Lost at sea, the 4th of June." Rousing myself, I laid the letters on the table. I stirred up the fire, which was still bright and cheering. I opened the book I had brought. I read quietly till about 11:30. I then lay down fully dressed upon the bed, and I told my servant he might retire to his own room, but to please keep himself awake. I bade him also to leave the door open between our 2 rooms. Thus, alone, I kept 2 candles burning on the table by my headboard. I placed my watch beside the weapons, and I calmly resumed my reading. Now opposite to me the fire burned clear, and on the hearthrug, seemingly asleep, lay my dog. In about 20 minutes, I felt an exceedingly cold air pass by my cheek like a sudden draught. I fancied the door to my right out to the landing place must have gotten open. But no, it was closed. I then turned my glance to my left, and I saw the flame of the candles violently swayed as by a wind. At that same moment, my watch beside the same moment, I got my tongue tied and had to start over again. At the same moment, my watch beside the revolver softly slid from the table. Softly, softly, no visible hand. Then it was gone. I sprang up, seizing the revolver with one hand, the dagger with the other. I was not willing that my weapon should share the fate of the watch. And thus armed, I looked around the floor, but no sign of my watch. 3 loud, distinct knocks were now heard at the headboard. My servant called out,
"Is that you, sir?"
"No, be on your guard." The dog now roused himself and sat on his haunches, his ears moving quickly backwards and then forwards. He kept his eyes fixed on me with a look so strange that he concentrated all my attention on himself. And slowly the dog rose up, all his hair bristling, and stood perfectly rigid, with that same wild stare. I had no time, however, to examine the dog. Presently my servant emerged from his room. And I mentioned his collectedness, his calmness, a few moments ago, did I not? Well, now, if ever I saw horror in a human face, it was then. I should not have recognized him had we met in the street, so altered was every lineament. He passed by me quickly, saying in a whisper that seemed scarcely to come from his lips, "Run, run, it's after me, run!" He gained the door to the landing. He pulled it open and he rushed forth. I followed him into the landing involuntarily, calling to him to stop. Without heeding me, he bounded down the stairs, clinging to the balusters, taking several steps at a time. I heard where I stood the street door open, and then I heard it clap to. I was left alone in the haunted house. It was but for a moment that I remained undecided whether or not to follow my servant. Pride and curiosity alike forbade me so dastardly a flight. I re-entered my room by closing the door after me, and I proceeded cautiously into the interior chamber. I encountered nothing to justify my servant's terror. I again carefully examined the walls to see if there were any concealed doorways. I could find no trace of one, not even a seam in the dull brown paper with which the room was hung. How then had the thing, whatever it was, which had so scared Franklin, how had the thing obtained ingress? Well, except through my own chamber. I returned to my room, and I shut and locked the door that opened upon the interior one. I stood on the hearth, expectant and prepared. I now perceived that my dog had slunk into an angle of the wall and was pressing himself close against it, as if literally striving to force his way into it. I approached the animal. I spoke to it. The poor brute was evidently beside itself with terror. It showed all its teeth, the slaver dropping from its jaws, and would certainly have bitten me if I had touched him. It did not seem to recognize me. Finding all efforts to soothe the animal in vain, and, fearing that his bite might be as venomous in that state as in the madness of hydrophobia, I left him alone. I placed my weapons on the table beside the fire. I seated myself, and I recommenced reading my book. Now, my theory is that the supernatural is, the impossible, and that what is called supernatural is only something in the laws of nature of which we have been hitherto ignorant. Therefore, if you follow me, if a ghost rise before me, I have not the right to say, so then the supernatural is possible. No, rather I should say, so then the apparition of a ghost is contrary to received opinion, is within the laws of nature. Well, that's my theory anyway. I now became aware that something interposed between the page I read and the light. The page was overshadowed. I looked up. I saw what I shall find it very difficult, perhaps impossible to describe. It was a darkness. A darkness shaping itself forth from the air in a very undefined outline. Now, I cannot say it was of a human form, and yet it had more resemblance to a human form, or rather a shadow, than to anything else. As it stood wholly apart and distinct from the air and the light around it, its dimensions seemed gigantic, the summit nearly touching the ceiling. While I gazed, a feeling of intense cold seized me. An iceberg before me could not have more chilled me, nor could the cold of an iceberg have been more purely physical, visceral. I feel convinced that it was not the cold caused by fear. As I continued to gaze, I thought, but this I cannot say with precision, I thought that I distinguished two eyes looking down on me from the height of that great dark shadow. One moment I fancied that I distinguished them clearly, the next they seemed gone. But still, two rays of a pale blue light frequently shot through the darkness as from the height on which I half believed, half doubted that I encountered those eyes. I strove to speak. My voice utterly failed me. I could only think to myself, is this fear? No, it is not fear. I strove to rise in vain. I felt as if weighted down by an irresistible force. Indeed, my impression was that of an immense and overwhelming power opposed to my own volition. That sense of utter inadequacy to cope with a force beyond man's, which one may feel physically in a storm at sea, in a conflagration, or when confronting some wild, terrible beast, or rather perhaps the shark of the ocean. I felt morally. Opposed to my will was another will, a will as far superior to its strength as storm, fire, and shark are superior in material force to the mere force of man. And now, as this impression grew on me, now came at last horror to a degree that no words can convey. Still, I retained my pride, if not my courage, and in my own mind I said, this is horror, but it is not fear. Unless I fear I cannot be harmed, my reason rejects this thing. It is an illusion. I do not fear. With so violent an effort, I succeeded at last in stretching out my hand towards the weapon on the table. As I did so, on the arm and shoulder I received a strange shock, and my arm fell to my side, powerless. And now, to add to my horror, the light began slowly to wane from the candles. They were not, as it were, extinguished, but their flame seemed very gradually withdrawn. It was the same with the fire. The light was extracted from the fuel. In a few minutes, the light was in the room was in utter darkness. The dread that came over me to be thus in the dark, with that dark thing whose power was so intensely felt, brought a reaction of nerve. In fact, terror had reached that climax, that either my senses must have deserted me or I must have burst through the spell. I did burst through it. I found voice, though the voice was a shriek. I remember that it broke forth with words like these: "I do not fear. My soul does not fear." And at the same time, I found strength to rise. Still in that profound gloom, I rushed to one of the windows. I tore aside the curtain. I flung open the shutters. I threw up the sash. My first thought was, light. I must have light. And then I saw the moon, high, clear, and calm. I felt a joy that almost compensated for the previous terror. There was a moon. There was also the light from the gas lamps in the deserted, slumberous street. I turned to look back into the room. The moon penetrated its shadow very palely and partially, but still, there was light. And the dark thing, well, whatever it might be, it was gone now, except that I could yet see a dim shadow, which seemed the shadow of that shade against the opposite wall. My eye now rested on the table. And from under that table, upon which there was no cloth or cover, there was an old mahogany round table. From under the table, there rose a hand, visible as far as the wrist. It was a hand, seemingly, as much of flesh and blood as my own, but the hand of an aged person, lean, wrinkled, small, to a woman's hand. The hand very softly closed on the 2 letters that lay on the table. Hand and letters both vanished. There then came the same 3 loud, measured knocks, the same I had heard before the headboard when this extraordinary drama had commenced. As those sounds slowly ceased, I felt the whole room vibrate sensibly, and at the far end there rose, as from the floor, sparks or globules like bubbles of light, many-colored, green, yellow, fire red, azure, like particles, a burst of particles. Up and down, to and fro, hither and thither, as tiny will-o'-the-wisps, the sparks moved, slow or swift, each at its own caprice. The chair, as in the drawing-room below, was now slid forward from the wall without apparent agency, and placed at the opposite side of the table from me. Suddenly, as forth from the chair, there grew a shape, a woman's shape. It was distinct as a shape of life, ghastly, ghastly as a shape of death. The face was that of a youth, with strange, mournful beauty about her. The throat and shoulders were bare, the rest of the form in a loose robe of cloudy white, began sleeking its long, yellow hair which fell over its shoulders. Its eyes were not turned towards me, but towards the door. It seemed listening, watching, waiting. The shadow of the shade in the background grew darker, and again I thought I beheld the eyes gleaming out from the summit of the shadow, eyes fixed upon that shape. As if from the door, though it did not open, there grew out another shape, equally distinct, equally ghastly, a man's shape, a young man's shape. It was in the dress of the last century, or rather a likeness of such dress, for both the male shape and the female, though defined, were evidently unsubstantial, impalpable, simulacra, phantasms. And there was something incongruous, grotesque, yet fearful in the contrast between the elaborate finery, the courtly precision of that old-fashioned garb with its ruffles and lace and buckles, and the corpse-like aspect and the ghost-like stillness of the flitting wearer. Just as the male shape approached the female shape, the dark shadow started from the wall. All three for a moment wrapped in darkness, and when the pale light returned, the two phantoms were as if in the grasp of the shadow that towered between them, and there was a bloodstain on the breast of the female, and the phantom male was leaning on its phantom sword, and the blood seemed trickling fast from the ruffles, from the lace, and the darkness of the interminable shadow swallowed them up. They were gone. And again, the bubbles of light shot and sailed and undulated, growing thicker and thicker, more wildly confused in their movements. Then the closet door to the right of the fireplace now opened, and from the aperture there came the form of an aged woman. In her hand she held those letters, the very letters over which I had seen the hand close, and behind her I heard a footstep. She turned round as if to listen, and then she opened the letters, and she seemed to read. And over her shoulder I saw a livid face, the face as of a man long drowned, bloated, bleached, seaweed tangled at its dripping hair. And at her feet lay a form of a corpse, and beside the corpse there cowered a child, a miserable, squalid child, with famine in its cheeks and fear in its eyes. And as I looked in the old woman's face, the wrinkles and the lines vanished, and it became a face of youth again. Hard-eyed and stony, was still youth. And the shadow darted forth, and darkened over these phantoms as I had darkened over the last. Nothing now was left but the shadow. And on that my eyes were intently fixed, till again eyes grew out of that shadow, malignant, serpent eyes, and the bubbles of light again rose and fell, and in their disordered, irregular, turbulent maze mingled with the wan moonlight. And now from these globules themselves, as from the shell of an egg, monstrous things burst out. The air grew filled with them, larvae, so bloodless and so hideous that I can no way describe them except to remind you of the swarming life which the microscope brings before your eyes in a drop of water. Things transparent, supple, agile, chasing each other, devouring each other, forms like naught ever beheld by the naked eye. As the shapes were without symmetry, so their movements were without order, and their very vagrancies there was no sport. They came round me and round, thicker and faster and swifter, swarming over my head, crawling over my right arm, which was outstretched in involuntary command against all evil beings. Sometimes I felt myself touched, but not by them. Invisible hands touched me. Once I felt the clutch as of cold, soft fingers at my throat. I was still equally conscious that if I gave way to fear, I should be in bodily peril, and I concentrated all my faculties in the single focus of resisting, stubborn will. And I turned my sight from the shadows above all, from those strange serpent eyes that had now become distinctly visible. For there, though in naught else around me, I was aware that there was a will of intense, creative, working evil, an opposing will which might crush down upon my own. The pale atmosphere in the room now began to redden as if in the air of some nearby conflagration. The larvae grew lurid as things that live in fire. Again the room vibrated. Again were heard the 3 measured knocks. And again all things were swallowed up in the darkness of that dark shadow, as if out of that darkness all had come, and into that darkness all had returned. As the gloom receded, the shadow was wholly gone. Slowly, as it had been withdrawn, the flame grew again into the candles on the table, again into the fuel in the grate. The whole room came once more, calmly, healthfully into sight. The 2 doors were still closed. The door linking into the servants' room still locked. In the corner of the wall into which he had so convulsively niched himself lay the dog. I called to him. No movement. I approached. The animal was dead. His eyes protruded, his tongue out of his mouth, froth gathered round his jaws. I took him in my arms. I brought him to the fire. I felt acute grief for the loss of my poor favorite dog. Acute self-reproach, too. I accused myself of his death. I imagined that he had died of fright. But what was my surprise on finding that his neck was actually broken. Another surprising circumstance. My watch was restored to the table from which it had been so mysteriously withdrawn. But it had stopped at the very moment it was so withdrawn, nor despite all the skill of the watchmaker has it ever gone since. That is to say, it will go in strange erratic way for a few hours, and then it comes to a dead stop. It's now worthless to me. At any rate, nothing more chanced for the rest of that night, nor indeed had I long to wait before the dawn broke. Nor till it was broad daylight did I quit that haunted house. Before I did so, I revisited the little blind room in which my servant and myself had been for a time imprisoned. I had a strong impression, for which I could not account, that from that room had originated the mechanism of the phenomenon, if I may use the term, which had been experienced in my chamber. And though I entered it now in the clear day, with the sun peering through the filmy windows, I still felt as I stood on its floors the creep of the horror which I had first there experienced the night before, and which had been so aggravated by what had passed in my own chamber. I could not indeed bear to stay more than half a minute within those walls. I descended the stairs, and again I heard the footfall before me of invisible feet. And when I opened the street door, I thought I could distinguish a very low laugh. I gained my own home, expecting to find my runaway servant there, but he had not presented himself, nor did I hear of him for 3 days, when I received a letter from him dated from Liverpool to this effect. Honoured sir, I humbly entreat your pardon, though I can scarcely hope that you will think that I deserve it, unless, which heaven forbid, you saw what I did. I feel that it will be years before I can recover myself, and as to being fit for service, it's out of the question. I'm therefore going to my brother-in-law at Melbourne. The ship sails tomorrow. I do nothing now but start and tremble and fancy it. Oh, God, it is behind me. I humbly beg you, honoured sir, to order my clothes and whatever wages are due to me to be sent to my mother's at Walworth. John knows her address. Returned in the evening to the house, to bring away in a hack cab the things I had left there with my poor dog's body. In this task I was not disturbed, nor did any incident worth note befall me, except that still, on ascending and descending the stairs, I heard the same footfall in advance of my own steps. On leaving the house, I went to Mr. James. He was at home. I returned him the keys. I told him that my curiosity was sufficiently gratified and related quickly what had passed. My persuasion is that these phenomenon, I said, originate in some mind now far distant or long gone, that mind had no distinct volition in anything that occurred, that what does occur reflects but its devious, motley, ever-shifting, half-formed thoughts. In short, my theory is that it has been but the dreams of such a mind put into action and invested with a semi-substance, that this mind is or was of immense power, such that it could set matter into movement, that is malignant and destructive, I believe. Some material force must have killed my dog. My poor dog. The same force might, for aught I know, have sufficed to kill myself had I been as subjugated by terror as the dog, had my intellect or my spirit given me no countervailing resistance in my will. I then told Mr. James of the 2 letters I had read, as well as the extraordinary manner in which they had disappeared, and I inquired if he thought they had been addressed to the woman who had died in the house, and if there were anything in her early history which could possibly confirm the dark suspicions to which those 2 letters gave rise. Mr. James seemed startled, and after musing a few moments, he answered, I am but little acquainted with the woman's earlier history, except as I before told you, sir, that her family were known to mine. Aye, but, sir, you revive some vague reminiscences to her prejudice. Here he pointed at his temple. I will make inquiries, sir, and inform you of their result. Still, even if we could admit the popular superstition that a person who had been either the perpetrator or the victim of dark crimes in life could revisit, as a restless spirit, the scene in which those crimes had been committed, well, sir, I observed that the house was infested by strange sights and sounds even before the old woman died, no? Oh, so what on earth can I do with my poor unfortunate house? Well, I continued, I will tell you what I would do. I am convinced of my own internal feelings that the small, unfurnished room at right angles to the door of the bedroom which I occupied forms a starting point. or a receptacle for the influences which haunt the house. I strongly advise you to have the walls opened and the floor removed, nay, the whole room pulled down. I observe that it is detached from the body of the house, built over the small backyard, and could be removed without injury to the rest of the building."
"And you think, if I did that?"
"You would cut off the telegraph wires, so to speak. Try it. I am persuaded that I am right. In fact, I have talked to a close friend, a Dr. Venkman, and he thinks so too." Well, about 10 days after I received a letter from Mr. James, telling me that he had visited the house since I had seen him, that he had found the 2 letters I had described, and replaced in the drawer from which I had taken them, that he had read them with misgivings like my own, that he had instituted a cautious inquiry about the woman to whom I had rightly conjectured they had been written. It seemed that 36 years ago, a year before the date of the letters, she had married, against the wish of her relations, a man of very suspicious character. In fact, actually it was Richard Venkman. He was a long-ago ancestor of Peter Venkman. I'm surprised you know him. In fact, he was generally believed, back up there again. It seemed that 36 years ago, a year before the date of the letters, she had married, against the wishes of her relations, a man of very suspicious character. Well, aren't they all? In fact, this man was generally believed to have been a pirate, but not a very good pirate. She herself was the daughter of very respectable tradespeople and had served in the capacity of a nursery governess before her marriage. She had a brother, a widower, who was considered wealthy and who had 1 child of about 6 years old. A month after the marriage, the body of this brother was found in the Thames near London Bridge. There seemed to be some marks of violence about his throat, but they would not deem sufficient to warrant the inquest in any other verdict than that of found drowned. The man and his wife took charge of the little boy, the deceased brother having by his will left his sister the guardian of his only child, and in event of the child's death, the sister inherited. Surprisingly, the child died about 6 months afterwards. It was supposed to have been neglected and ill-treated. The neighbors deposed to have heard it shriek at night. The surgeon who had examined it after death said that it was emaciated as if from want of nourishment. The body was covered with livid bruises. It seemed that one winter night the child had sought to escape, had crept out into the backyard, tried to scale the wall, fallen back exhausted, and been found at morning on the stones in a dying state. Although there was some evidence of cruelty, there was none of murder. And the aunt and her husband had sought to palliate cruelty by alleging the exceeding stubbornness and perversity of that child, who was declared to be half-witted. Anyway, be that as it may, at the orphan's death, the aunt inherited her brother's fortune. Before the first wedded year was out, the man quitted England abruptly and never returned to it. He obtained a cruising vessel, which was lost in the Atlantic 2 years afterwards. The widow was left in affluence, but reverses of various kinds had befallen her. A bank broke, an investment failed. She went into a small business and became insolvent. Then she entered into service, sinking lower and lower from housekeeper down to maid of all work, never long retaining place, though nothing decided against her character was ever alleged. She was considered sober, honest, peculiarly quiet in her ways, still nothing prospered with her. And so she had dropped into the workhouse from which Mr. James had taken her, to be placed in charge of the very house which she had rented as mistress in the first year of her wedded life. Mr. James added that he had passed an hour alone in the unfurnished room which I had urged him to destroy, I and Richard Venkman, Peter's great-grandfather, and that his impressions of dread, while there was so great, though he had neither heard nor seen anything, that he was eager to have the walls bared and the floors removed as I had suggested. He had engaged persons for this work and would commence any day I would name. And so the day was accordingly fixed. I repaired to the haunted house, my friend Richard Venkman with me. We went into the blind, dreary room. We took up the skirting and then the floors. Under the rafters, covered with rubbish, was found a trap door, quite large enough to admit a man. It was closely nailed down with clamps and rivets of iron. On removing these, we descended into a room below, the existence of which had never been suspected. In this room, there had been a window and a flue, but they had been bricked over, evidently for many years. By the help of candles, we examined this place. It still retained some mouldering furniture, 3 chairs, an oak settle, a table, all of the fashion about 80 years ago. There was a chest of drawers against the wall in which we found half-rotted away old-fashioned articles of a man's dress, such as might have been worn 80 or 100 years ago by gentlemen of some rank, costly steel buckles and buttons like those of yet worn in court dresses, a handsome court sword, and a waistcoat which had once been rich with gold lace, but which was now blackened and foul with damp. We found 5 guineas, a few silver coins, and an ivory ticket, probably for some place of entertainment long since passed away. But our main discovery was in a kind of iron safe fixed to the wall, the lock of which cost us great trouble to pick. In this iron safe were 3 shelves and 2 small drawers. Ranged on the shelves were several small bottles of crystal, hermetically stopped. They contained the colorless, volatile essences, of the nature of which I shall only say they were not poisons. Phosphor and ammonia entered into some of them. There were also some very curious glass tubes and a small pointed rod of iron with a large lump of rock crystal, another of amber, also a lodestone of great power. In one of the drawers we found a miniature portrait set in gold and retaining the freshness of its colors most remarkably, considering the length of time it had probably been there. The portrait was that of a man who might be somewhat advanced in middle life, perhaps 47, 48. It was a remarkable face, a most impressive face. If you could fancy some mighty serpent transformed into a man, preserving in the human lineaments of the old serpent type, you'd have a better idea of that countenance than long descriptions convey. The width and the flatness of frontal, the tapering elegance of contour disguising the strength of the deadly jaw, the long, large, terrible eye, glittering and green as the emerald, withal a certain ruthless calm, as if from the consciousness of an immense power within. Mechanically, I turned round the miniature portrait to examine the back of it. I detected a spring, and this, on being pressed, opened the back of the miniature as a lid. Within the lid were engraved, "Mariana, to thee. Be faithful in life and in death, Mariana." We had found no difficulty in opening the first drawer within the iron safe. We found a great difficulty in opening the second drawer. It was not locked, but resisted all efforts till we inserted in the chinks the edge of a chisel. When we had thus drawn it forth, we found a very singular apparatus in the nicest order. Upon a small thin book, or rather a tablet, was a saucer of crystal. This saucer was filled with a clear liquid. On that liquid floated a kind of a needle, a compass perhaps, shifting rapidly round, but instead of the usual points of the compass, there were 7 strange characters, not very unlike those used by astrologers to denote the planets. A peculiar but not strong or displeasing odor came from this drawer, which was lined with a wood that we afterwards discovered to be hazel. Whatever the cause of this odor, it produced a material effect on the nerves. We all felt it, even the 2 workmen who were in the room, a creeping, tingling sensation from the tips of the fingers to the roots of the hair. Impatient to examine the tablet, I removed the saucer. As I did so, the needle of the compass went round and around with exceeding swiftness, and I felt a shock that ran through my whole frame, so that I dropped the saucer on the floor. The liquid was spilled, the saucer was broken, the compass rolled to the end of the room, and at that instant the walls shook to and fro, as if a giant had swayed and rocked them. The 2 workmen were so frightened, they ran up the ladder by which we had descended from the trapdoor, but seeing nothing more happen, they were easily induced to return to us. Meanwhile, I opened the tablet. It was bound in a plain red leather with a silver clasp. It contained but 1 sheet of thick vellum, and on that sheet were inscribed, within a double pentacle, words in old monkish Latin, which were literally to be just translated thus: "On all that it can reach within these walls, sentient or inanimate, living or dead, as moves the needle, so works my will. Accursed be this house, and restless be the dwellers therein." We found nothing more. Mr. James burned the tablet and its anathema. He razed to the foundations the part of the building containing the secret room with the chamber over it. He had then the courage to inhabit the house himself for a month. And a quieter, better-conditioned house could not be found in all of London. So, that is The Haunted and the Haunters Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.